Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hello everyone, I'm Troy Moling, and thanks for joining us today on Market Journal. Glad you could spend a little bit of your day with us, and for those of you who are still planting, hope that it's going well for you. Real quick, I do want to mention, as United States and global health officials continue to address the spread of COVID-19, UNL is also monitoring the situation. Updates can be found at covid19.unl.edu and on the Market Journal website. And beginning the broadcast, agriculture has been in the national news with the temporary closure of various meat processing plants throughout Nebraska and the country. This, of course, is due to the spread of COVID-19 from workers at those plants. Now, Nebraska Extension has released some best management practices for small processors to follow and help mitigate the spread of the disease. I spoke with Extension beef educator Dennis Burson about it.
I think part of the strong responses that we've seen here lately in terms of the number of illnesses that are reported at a processing plant is twofold. One, you have people that are non-symptomatic and they were relying upon symptoms to do the evaluation. And secondly, with testing, why then they found those individuals, and so then the numbers start to look a little bit higher than we would normally expect.
And when it comes to best practices, is it really much different between a large and a small? Just maybe they're on a larger scale when you're dealing with the larger processors?
Well, in some respects, yes, but in other respects, there are some differences. So the larger processors are not selling directly to the public. And the smaller processors, that's their customer. And so they will have customers that could come to their store, and many times in these rural areas, why people get to know each other very well and feel like they have access to all parts of the production facility when they normally come to visit. And so one of the recommendations that we started out with was you've got to limit that kind of visitation in your facility, and you've got to figure out how to work with your customers. And like many other stores we've seen around in the cities here, is that maybe they would do that by providing curbside service or asking for orders to deliver, or if they wanted to leave their retail space open in the front part of the store, why just avoid allowing customers to go back any further, and then in that retail space do some really good things in terms of practicing avoidance and sanitation and cleaning as customers are coming through.
How would you define, or how would you classify what's a small processor versus a large processor?
Oh, now you're going to have tough questions. Because let me think about this. I think
Sure.
I think that in the USDA definition, why then there's to get in the small category, it only takes less than 500 employees. But then also, as we look at the typical plants here in Nebraska, why then we can see people that fit into USDA's definition of a very small operation, but they might run from less than 10 to sometimes 40 to 50 employees at a facility.
Gotcha. I would like to get into some of those best practices. So we're not going to be able to mention everything, of course, because there's a lot on the list, but we are going to post everything on the Market Journal website. So give me some of the top points that you'd really like to hammer home for the viewers who are watching. Of course, most of us, we are familiar with things like hand washing, standing 6 feet apart, avoiding shaking hands. But what are some guidelines that meat processors need to follow that we might not think about?
Well, the things that I would highlight as kind of categories are some of the traditional things that you've brought up, but then plus that, they really need to play an education and a compliance type of role with their employees. First of all, this is not a issue with food safety or the food that they produce. The COVID-19 is not transmitted through foods, and so it's all about protecting their employees and avoiding transmittal of the virus. And so some of the things that that they may or may not do in current situations would deal with, first of all, providing education to their employees about the disease and make sure they understand what it is, so that they can report to the owners and the operators of these plants if they do think they're getting the sick illness, and then also have to make planning of what you do if an employee does show up sick. And so those are some unusual things. Other than that, why then it's spacing, wearing proper personal protective equipment. That could be like the face mask, cloth face mask may be added, which are probably not normally worn during production times, other than the times that we're having now. And then some of their normal gear in terms of aprons and stuff, and making sure that those things get changed and laundered and on a regular basis.
Dennis tells me these policies are changing and constantly evolving. You can find more information on the Market Journal website. Moving on, and another way the pandemic is impacting the cattle industry is with a shortage of distillers grains. Less travel and less need for fuel has given way to a decreased demand for ethanol, which distillers grains are a byproduct of. Nebraska Extension Beef Feedlot Nutrition Specialist Galen Erickson joined me this week to offer some ways producers can replace distillers grains in cattle diets.
Distillers grains provide protein and energy. And so some situations you're feeding distillers grains primarily as a protein supplement. In many cases, that might be a cow that needs extra protein, or it may be a backgrounding calf that's on a high forage diet. And the interesting thing about proteins, it gets a little complicated, is that generally protein we think of as having two functions when we feed it to cattle. We need protein that helps the microbes in the rumen. We call that rumen degradable protein. And we need, if the microbes can't produce enough protein to meet the animal's needs, then we feed what we call bypass protein. Bypasses the microbes in the rumen, and we call that rumen undegradable protein. So the net result is this: distillers grains are probably historically have been the most economical source of bypass protein, so they fit really well when fed to forage fed cattle, and especially younger, lighter growing cattle. With that said, works great in the feedlot setting too, where we replace corn, and there we're using as both a protein and energy source. And of course, that's something we've researched heavily, and it feeds better than corn. So it's not as simple as saying, well, I'm just going to buy this other protein because it may not be the right type. Mm-hmm. You can't just replace it with something like urea, even though urea is fine, excellent protein source if needed for the microbes. It's not the same as distillers. So, but if you're a feeder, if you feed cattle, you've been getting both. You've been getting the protein and the energy, and now when you replace distillers, you got to find alternative protein, as well as probably not the expectation. Change your expectation. The cattle won't perform quite as well.
And as far as health issues we might need to watch out for in cattle if they're taking in fewer distillers grains, anything you can speak on with that?
Well, certainly distillers grains work great for receiving calves and when calves first come in, because it has the right kind of protein, but it's also very palatable. So you ought to be a little careful. There's probably a little bit more challenge on how to bring in new calves. But probably the biggest issues, if you've got cattle that are on feed and being fed distillers grains, then you no longer have that source. The biggest risk there is pulling the distillers out and replacing it with corn. You increase the starch content of the diet, can lead to overconsumption of starch and acidosis in the rumen. Too much acid being produced too fast can cause more bloat incidences. So there are some real challenges, primarily related to replacing distillers with something like starch and corn or other grains. But it's almost all acidosis related and that kind of risk.
Okay. And would like to get into some of the recommendations that you have for producers and feed yards, what they should do if they're running low on distillers grains, or maybe they've just run out of them completely. What are some of the main points that you'd like to highlight with that?
Well, I think one of the things that distillers allows us to do is feed lower quality forages. So many feed yards have now used stalks or straws or low quality hays as a roughage or as the forage in the diet. Those are fed generally at low inclusions, less than 10% of the diet. Well, they work well because they're mixed in with wet or modified wet distillers grains. If we have to pull the distillers, now you generally would see a benefit of feeding higher quality forages for rough feed, such as alfalfa hay. If you have corn silage, that would be great because it adds moisture and helps with mixing. So first consideration is forage and how you're feeding it. Secondly is moisture in the diet. It's actually a benefit because it helps with mixing. So if you don't have access to some of the wet distillers grains, now you want to look at other ways to add moisture. That can be liquid byproducts, that could be water, that could be wet forages like silages, could be wet corn like high moisture corn, liquid supplements. All those liquids help with holding the diet together, mixing and preventing sorting. And then the big issue is what to do about supplemental protein. You will have to supplement additional protein in your supplement that you're purchasing. That's primarily going to be urea, but remember, that's not exactly comparing apples to apples in protein type. So the real conundrum is, what do I do with young, lightweight growing cattle that may respond to this bypass protein that's high in distillers? And there's not a lot of inexpensive options out there. So many people will probably feed more soybean meal, but it'll take even more soybean meal in some of those situations. So, we've taken it for granted for almost 15 to 20 years, just feeding distillers. And so, but with all that said, we can feed cattle without distillers, but it's just a little more challenging. So obviously we're going to feed more corn. Last thing I would mention is it's very important to still price the distillers and make sure it's a competitive buy relative to other protein sources, because the price unfortunately has certainly gone up compared to corn price. So it encourages us to fine tune it and feed just what we need anyway. But I would still encourage producers to price it on a per unit of protein basis to make sure it compares favorably with other sources.
If you have more questions, you're encouraged to reach out to your local extension office. It's time for markets now, and Darin Fessler of Lakefront Futures and Options is our guest this week. He's been following the economic impacts of the beef industry from the beginning, so we're going to get his thoughts on that, plus a whole lot more. First, though, I wanted to hear how this pandemic has changed his day-to-day role as an ag advisor. We spoke on Wednesday.
What has taken place over, let's say, the last 6 weeks has been really detrimental, really, to the overall outlook and probably the optimism for producers going forward here. And if you look at, on a day-to-day basis, what has transpired here, I mean, we were, definitely utilizing last summer's rally for the benefit of producers this year. We were hedging some stuff last summer, even for D's 20 this year. So I'm glad we did that. But obviously, when we start looking at, what would be the, maybe the acres picture for this year, and what could be the carryout picture for this year, even back in January and February, and even the early starts of March, before we really got hit with this coronavirus headlines, and even the ethanol side of things, which is a whole nother topic, we were pretty aggressively buying puts, selling calls, just to get a little bit more protection on the book. Not that we knew what would happen with the ethanol destruction. It just happened to be that, we got a lot of acres planted, or the assumption that we're going to get a lot of acres planted. And then we got hit with the virus that really hit the crude oil market, and it essentially hit the ethanol demand and really hit that hard. So, I mean, call it right place at the right time, but really, again, it was managing that risk for the producer.
And another big story, meat industry, cattle markets, especially with COVID-19 over the last few weeks. So I wanted to get your take on that. Slaughter, it's way down. Boxed beef, it's way up. So you would think these two markets would kind of behave in a similar way, but it's almost like they're two different commodities. Kind of break down the economics on that for us.
Yeah, it's a really big disconnect if you look at what's going on in the boxed beef numbers, which have been pretty parabolic, over late, and then what's going on in the futures market. And so if you look at, it's a fine balance here between the packing industry right now and to be able to get the workers safely and healthy back to work, to get the capacity up to much higher levels than what it's currently at. Now, I've been somewhat vocal on the packer issue lately, but it's one of these things is, you look at the retail side of things and people are, well, boy, look at Hy-Vees and look at some of these other retailers that they're limiting the amount of meat that we can purchase. And it's not the farmers making a lot of money here. It's the ability to get the workers safely back to the packing plants and get the capacity back online. And until that really happens, it's the economics of it. It's supply and demand. It's not that we don't have the meat. We just don't have the supply of meat that we used to, hitting the retail shelves. Mm-hmm. And so it is the fine balance of what does the packers really do at the end of the day to maintain a healthy and safe work environment for their employees. Again, balancing that with, we have hogs that you really can't back that market up too much, and you have cattle that's ready for slaughter. That's really the big detriment of agriculture right now is how do we get these creatures and that are ready for harvest, how do we get them to the plants? And, sadly, there's been some stuff that's happened in our industry that I think as far as people in the ag industry, we need to get ahead of that curve and explain to the public why we're doing what we're doing and what some of these producers have to do at the end of the day to shore up their livestock.
Yeah, so all that being said, say there's a producer who's just finished calving not too long ago, or someone who's managing a feedlot. What are some things that they can be doing right now?
Well, it's a difficult situation. Is obviously with the contacts they have with their packing plants and the people who buy their livestock. Keeping in close contact with them is obviously a very, very good situation. I'm always a big believer in communication is first and foremost probably the most productive thing in business. But when you have, say, for example, hogs that are ready for slaughter and there's no place to go, there's got to be a lot of tough situations to be made, and sadly, it's what you have to do as an industry.
All right, let's move on to planting now, and been seeing lots of farmers in Nebraska posting pictures about being done with planting. Some are getting close. Kind of give us a breakdown on some things that you've been seeing on that end.
Yeah, the planting progress has been really, really good across the Western Corn Belt. We know that. I think that if you look at the Western Corn Belt, especially in the Northern Plains, you really got to focus on what's going on in North Dakota because there is going to be quite a bit of PP. I don't think the market's really maybe calculated in yet. Now, granted, I have a lot of producers up there who are going to say they've been thinking about PP for a while now, and really they're probably going to be more financially better off if they just take that PP. Conditions are very, very wet, but not all of North Dakota is in that same boat. We're talking, if you around the Jamestown area, the Fargo area, the Carrington areas of North Dakota, which is a good production areas of that state, those are the ones that are having the issues. And if you go further west, not so much issues. Granted, there's going to be a little bit of slowness with the rains across Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, but I'm still not too concerned. I know there's been some talk about the freeze maybe over the week and stuff that maybe would nip some of this corn that's been emerged, but we'll see how that all pans out. But right now, I'm not too concerned with how the planting progress is going. It looks pretty good.
And for those who are finished or about to be finished with planting in this current ag climate, what are some things that we need to be focusing on as we head through the growing season?
Yeah, I think that having targets in place and having some type of structure in your marketing plan, whether that's grains or cattle, just have some type of targets in place, especially when you get some of these maybe seasonal bounces. Let's knock on wood, we get some. But, you got to look at, okay, the acres and what potential yield could be and the overall production. I mean, prices could get much, much uglier from here. Hopefully they don't. I don't want to be a bear that's constantly just hammering the market, but it's somewhat the reality we're in. And so just having targets in place, managing that risk and really thinking it from a business standpoint, if corn goes to 420 or 450 or whatever that price may be, that's not the problem. What if we go much, much lower than these levels where it doesn't work from a break-even standpoint?
Next week, we'll be joined by Doug Simon with TradeOS. It's time for a check of the weather now with Nebraska Extension Ag Climatologist and Market Journal Chief Meteorologist Al Dutcher. And as Al mentioned last week, he's off today, but before he left, he recorded a segment to tell us about another weather-related topic we need to know. Take it away, Al.
Well, folks, here we again for the weekly weather segment, and this week we decided to talk to you a little bit about the El Nino Southern Oscillation. This is the area of the equatorial Pacific that we look at for the formation of La Nina and El Nino conditions. Now, typically during El Nino conditions, we see abnormal warming in the equatorial region. During La Nina's abnormal cooling, and those do have an impact, particularly in the southern hemisphere, as it typically peaks right around the Christmas period, which is the middle of their summer period. So for Australia, South Africa, and Brazil, during El Niños we tend to see below normal yields, and during La Niñas above normal yields. The big fly in the ointment is Argentina. During the La Nina events, we typically would expect to see below normal yields, and with El Niños above normal yields. But here in the northern hemisphere, it has a big influence on whether or not we see split flow pattern develop in the United States during the winter period, or that we see a very strong aggressive northern stream pattern. So the most current update of the ENSO is that we look here last October, very warm sea surface conditions above normal in the Gulf of Alaska. You'll notice some cooling starting to show up in the eastern equatorial Pacific with a little bit of warmth out in the central equatorial Pacific. Look at the changes that we have experienced since last October, and now we're looking toward the middle of March, and we see well below normal sea surface temperatures in the Gulf of Alaska. We're starting to see some warmer than normal sea surface conditions off the very western Aleutian Islands, and we also notice that we're starting to see some cold being drawn into the central equatorial Pacific, and the eastern equatorial Pacific has turned warmer than normal. Conversely, we're also starting to see a return to rainfall in portions of Australia and South Africa. All of these are good indications that we are starting to see a reversal of the fortunes that we've seen under the previous regime, which more El Nino-like dominated. So in terms of the forecast as we go out through this growing season, in January, the most current ENSO forecast was that this red line is to say just above the 0 degree line, so more on the warmer phase. You can see that there is a spread in the models, but pretty much consistency in between the models. Now, as we look at the February update, all of a sudden we see a crossover of this red line into the cooler phase of the equatorial Pacific occurring sometime within the May, June, July period, instead of trying to cross way out into the July, August, September period. And the latest update that was released in March shows the same general trend, just a little bit stronger in terms of the intensity of the coolness, but generally turning in the July through June, July, August period. So it does look like we're going to move to the cooler side of the equatorial Pacific late this summer, and generally for us here in Nebraska, that means warmer and drier conditions during the fall period. It also means that if this thing takes off a little bit earlier, that we tend to see some drier conditions, particularly in our irrigated areas of western Nebraska, means some increased water usage. So we'll pay particular attention to this next 40 to 45 day period all the way through mid-March, because that definitely will determine the snowpack in the southern Rockies and how vulnerable we are to drought going forward.
Thanks, Al. Finally today, a common crop for Midwesterners is winter wheat. And as the name suggests, it's no stranger to the cold. However, if it emerges too quickly, it can develop freeze injury. We spoke with Nebraska Extension's Cody Creech to learn more.
Winter wheat is no stranger to colder temperatures. Nebraska Extension Dryland Cropping System Specialist Cody Creech says the crop in Nebraska so far has been setting itself up for success against freeze injury.
This year, at least in western Nebraska, we had a pretty cool year so far. We haven't had a lot of growth in our wheat, which has been good because these cold temps that we've had have really hurt the wheat a lot. But the wheat wasn't as far along development-wise, which has been good. In eastern Nebraska, the wheat's a little more developed, so it's a little more prone to injury. And you'll see that those fields that have higher rates of nitrogen, they're going to be more injured with freeze because they're going to have more growth compared to a field that might have lower fertility or was planted later. Things like that are going to inhibit the growth. And in years like this, it's going to help to protect that wheat by being smaller.
Dr. Creech says growth stage as well as duration of the lower temperatures are key influencers for freeze injury.
It's all about how cold it gets and for how long and what stage that wheat is at. And so typically when we talk about freezing temperatures, it's got to be at a certain temperature for at least 2 hours. And that that growth stage is important. And so in western Nebraska, most of our wheat out here is not jointed. That growing point is still below the soil surface, which helps to protect that wheat. But in eastern Nebraska, some of that wheat is jointed, and that growing point is starting to move up a little bit. And so for jointed wheat, typically if it can get down to close to 20 degrees and it can stay there for a few hours, it'll do some damage. A lot of the damage we see is cosmetic. What we start to worry about is when that wheat is more developed, it's getting closer to boot stage, and we get down at 28 degrees and we stay there for a few hours. That's when we really start to worry. We do worry when we see really cold temperatures and that wheat's more developed. We're going to start to see yield hits, and that's what we don't want to see.
When assessing freeze injury in wheat, patience is key. Judging too early could mean writing off a crop when there's still opportunity for it to grow.
And so we always encourage folks to at least wait 7 to 10 days before they really go out and assess what's going on. With these warmer days that we've already had some regrowth in that wheat that has been damaged. And so giving it some time to grow back is beneficial. We typically, in Nebraska, it's almost guaranteed at some point it's going to get some freeze damage. It happens every year. Things start to green up, and then we get cold storms that come in and the cold weather. It happens. And so we just have to be flexible. We have to be patient and anticipate that it's going to happen and have a plan B. There's still plenty of time if we decide that our wheat crop has been hit too hard. There's plenty of time that we can go back. We can put in a different crop still this spring. But before we take out our wheat crop, we absolutely have to contact our insurance adjuster, make sure that we have that covered before we take the crop out and put something else in.
Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Maddie McIntosh.
Most winter wheat varieties have been bred to withstand Nebraska's climate, but you should check with FSA as well before making any major changes to your field. That's going to do it for this week's show. So glad you could join us today. Hope to see you right back here next time. I'm Troy Moling. Thanks for watching.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.